At 5:15 a.m. near Pokrovsk, 60 tons of Russian engineering confidence met reality and lost. What was meant to be a quick improvised river crossing instead collapsed into a glowing wreck of twisted steel, sinking helplessly into the frozen mud of the Kazhenyi Torets River. In the pale morning light, the structure looked less like a bridge and more like a warning sign written in fire. Here is the part Moscow was hoping no one would notice. While global headlines were busy following photo ops of Trump and Zelensky shaking hands over talk of peace, the Kremlin tried to sneak in one last move. A quiet gamble. A $5 million T-80 bridge layer hybrid rushed forward like a Frankenstein project, stitched together by desperation sent toward the river to claw out a final slice of territory. The timing could not have been worse. The planning could not have been sloppier. This was not bold strategy. This was wishful thinking. The crossing failed almost instantly, turning Russian ambition into scrap metal before it ever reached the far bank. Ukraine did not need a massive counterattack or a dramatic announcement. Gravity-cold steel and poor decisions did the job just fine. It was another reminder that modern warfare does not forgive shortcuts, and it certainly does not pause for political theater. If you want to understand how moments like this quietly shape the battlefield, while the cameras look elsewhere, like the video, subscribe to Titan Navy and turn on notifications. We track what actually matters, not just what makes the headlines. Moscow's 2026 offensive effectively ended right there, reduced to a pile of smoking scrap. Ukrainian drones locked down an entire 15-vehicle convoy, freezing them in place, like luxury lawn ornaments embedded in mud. To understand how it came to this, rewind to December 26, 2025, at 4:00 a.m. near the village of Volodymyrivka. A 60-ton disaster was inching its way toward the riverbank. The Kazhenyi Torets is barely 70 feet wide, but it might as well be a fortress. Steep vertical banks, bottomless mud, and no alternate routes. A textbook bottleneck, the kind every competent military planner learns to fear. Out of a blizzard crawled Russia's latest improvisation, a $5 million T-80 BVM main battle tank stripped down, cut apart, and welded into an improvised bridge layer. Engineers had bolted half of an old TMM-3 steel bridge onto its roof, added wooden planks, then wrapped the whole thing in a crude turtle shell cage meant to hide it from drones. It was a Frankenstein monster on tracks. The reason for this grotesque solution was simple. By late 2025, the Kremlin had burned through more than 1,000 specialized engineering vehicles. With nothing left, they started sacrificing top-tier tanks just to cross a 70-foot creek, using a Ferrari to haul gravel, expensive, top-heavy, and begging to fail. The Russians believed the blizzard was protection. Reality was less forgiving. Thermal drones don't care about snow. That T-80 engine glowed like a neon sign in a dark alley. On Ukrainian tactical maps, this riverbank wasn't a crossing point. It was a 24/7 kill zone. As the bank crumbled under the tank's weight and its tracks screamed for traction, Moscow was unknowingly betting the entire offensive on one improvised bridge. Ukraine, meanwhile, had already RSVP'd to this New Year's disaster. By 5:00 a.m., the storm was ripping across the steppe at 40 miles per hour. Inside the lead vehicle, the Russian commander stared at his thermal display, watching fresh snow erase his tracks. He felt untouchable. To him, the storm was a gift, finally blinding Ukrainian eyes in the sky. Confidence turned into arrogance. He signaled the convoy forward toward the Kazhenyi Torets, convinced nature had finally chosen a side. Ukraine had been watching those heat signatures for 96 hours. 3 miles away, inside a concealed cellar, a Ukrainian team tracked that T-80 engine glowing against the frozen terrain. They launched the first wave. 4 standard radio-controlled FPV drones, cheap disposable scouts, thrown straight into the gale to confirm the target. It was a textbook ambush right up until Russian warning systems began screaming. The Russian commander slammed the switch on his Pol 21 and R330Z GTEL jamming systems. This wasn't light interference, it was an electronic sledgehammer. 1 second, a Ukrainian pilot saw a grainy road. The next, the screen dissolved into violent gray static. And that was the moment the Russians thought they had control again. Imagine trying to finish a phone call while someone fires a jet engine 3 inches from your ear. That is exactly what those Ukrainian drones ran into. In an instant, 3 of the 4 video feeds dissolved into solid gray. Those drones were not just disrupted, they were electronically lobotomized mid-air, tumbling into the snow as useless piles of plastic and lithium. Inside the Russian tank, the crew actually cheered. They watched the drones fall and genuinely believed they had just won the lottery. "The sky is ours," they bragged over the radio. Emboldened, Russia doubled down and launched its own high-end countermeasure drones, fiber optic systems tethered by physical cables. These Russian snakes did not care about radio jamming at all. They slid over the riverbank and fed the convoy a crystal-clear 4K thermal picture of the crossing. The 60-ton bridge layer began its slow mechanical crawl. Steel arms extended out over the mud, reaching roughly 70% deployment. The operators were already tasting victory watching the bridge inch toward the far bank, unaware that Ukraine was simply clearing the stage for what came next. At 5:05 a.m., Ukraine decided to poke the Russian ego. 6 decoy drones went up. Cheap trash platforms fitted with oversized infrared emitters and obnoxiously loud radio signatures. They were not meant to kill anything. They were designed to scream, "Look at me," across every Russian sensor. The trench teams took the bait instantly, hook, line, and sinker. As vague silhouettes flickered through the blizzard, adrenaline took over. Russian defenders panicked, convinced a massive swarm attack was unfolding. The riverbank erupted. 12-gauge shotguns and AK-12 rifles started barking into the whiteout muzzle flashes, strobing red through the snow. It looked dramatic, almost impressive. It was also a catastrophic error. Every trigger pull was a flare. Hot barrels exposed bodies, muzzle blasts, all of it lit up Ukrainian thermal feeds like neon signage. The Russians were so busy playing batting practice with cheap plastic that they completely stopped watching the ground. While they high-fived over shooting down a few $100s worth of decoys, the real threat entered the fight. The Wild Hornets arrived. These were not hobby drones. The Wild Hornet is the heavyweight of Ukraine's FPV fleet, built for speed and carrying a serious structural decommissioning package. While Russian defenders were aiming skyward, 5 Hornets came in at roughly 100 miles per hour, skimming the frozen mud at less than 20 feet. They flew low enough to stay beneath most lines of fire, using the roar of shotguns to mask the whine of their own motors. The Russian commander realized something was wrong only when he heard a different kind of scream. Not from a drone, but from his own recovery team. 2 Wild Hornets punched straight through the chaos threading between trees with surgical precision. They ignored the bridge entirely and went for the lifeline, slamming directly into the fuel tanks of the recovery vehicles parked at the river's edge. The result was a thermal event so violent it physically lifted the rear ends of armored vehicles off the ground. That was the moment the crossing stopped being an engineering problem and became a catastrophe. The blizzard was suddenly erased by a massive orange fireball, turning the snowy riverbank into a slaughterhouse of burning metal. The Russian support team was neutralized almost instantly, their vehicles and equipment converted into twisted, charred scrap. With those recovery anchors gone, the 60-ton bridge tank was left dangerously isolated, exposed in the open. It was now a sitting duck. Still desperate and stubborn, the Russian commander ordered the T-80 to keep pushing the bridge forward on its own. This was no longer a calculated maneuver. It was a gamble driven by panic. And Russia was about to make its most reckless move of the night. The Wild Hornet is the high-performance bruiser of the Ukrainian arsenal, built for raw speed and a heavy structural decommissioning payload. 5 of them came screaming in low, hugging the terrain at less than 30 feet to stay under radar coverage. This was the aerial equivalent of a high-wire act, but these drones thrive in chaos. 2 punched through the electronic noise, threading the gap between trees and slamming directly into the MTLB recovery vehicle that had been supporting the bridge layer. The impact was catastrophic. The lead MTLB suffered a violent thermal event that turned the storm into a white-hot explosion. Inside the Russian commander's headset, confident chatter was replaced by screaming and static as entire recovery teams vanished into smoke and fire. With its anchors gone, the 60-ton bridge tank began to shudder violently. The riverbank, already weakened by the blast, groaned under the T-80's massive tracks. The bridge hung at roughly 70% deployment, its balance badly offset the whole structure teetering. The celebration on the Russian command net collapsed into a frantic call for help, as the commander realized his so-called solution was now perched on the edge of a frozen abyss. Moscow finally understood the appetizer was over, and the real danger was just beginning. At 5:07 a.m., another wave of 10 quadcopter drones arrived. Russia was not ready to walk away from a $5 million bonfire. Watching his support vehicles melt into the snow, the Russian commander went all in on electronic brute force. Jammers screamed at full power. At the same time, 12-gauge shotguns and AK-12 rifles opened up again, ripping into the whiteout with red tracers and buckshot. This was no longer just jamming. It was physical extermination. Ukraine tried to push through with additional radio-controlled FPVs, but the combination was punishing. Between the crushing electronic interference and a literal rain of lead, 3 more Wild Hornets were torn apart mid-air, their wreckage swallowed by the storm. Russian infantry cheered as debris fell, convinced they were witnessing a masterclass in defense. The turtle shell cage around the bridge tank also appeared to earn its keep, deflecting fragments and preventing immediate damage to the core hydraulics. And behind this wall of fire and noise, the Russian fiber-optic drones continued to operate, feeding the commander just enough confidence to keep digging deeper into a disaster of his own making. Tethered by glass threads and completely immune to the chaos below, these drones provide a stable, high-definition guide for the bridge tank as it grinds forward through the mud. Massive hydraulic arms scream under the pressure, forcing the steel spans farther and farther out. 70%, 80%, 90%. The lead section now hovers just inches above the far bank. Inside the command unit, the Russian officer feels like a tactical genius. He watches his men swat down Ukrainian drones while the bridge inches closer to completion. He has already signaled the 15-vehicle armored convoy to start its engines. Diesel roars fill the air as tanks and MTLBs prepare to cross the Kazini Tourettes. Moscow is convinced they have finally broken Ukraine in this sector. In their minds, the negotiation is over and the fight is won. In reality, they have walked straight into the most lethal trap of the winter. Ukraine was not running out of drones. They were waiting for the Russian bridge to reach its maximum mechanical stress point. With the bridge at 90%, the center of gravity is fully exposed, and the support anchors are gone. This is the perfect moment for a guest that does not care about shotguns or jamming. This is the end of the line. At 5:12 a.m., the Russian bridge dangles at 95%, the lead span just inches from the muddy far bank. In the Russian commander's mind, he is already being pinned with a medal. The armored convoy revs its engines, smoke pouring from exhausts ready to storm across. They believe the gauntlet is over, and the road to Pokrovsk is wide open. In reality, the nightmare is just beginning. From a hidden position 10 miles back, Ukraine releases the final strike. 3 fiber-optic-controlled FPV drones. The elite assassins of the drone world. Forget radio waves. These units are tethered by thin glass threads carrying a 1.5 gigabit data stream with 0 lag and 0 chance of being jammed. Russian electronic warfare systems scream at full power, but to these drones, there is only silence. The pilots have a crystal-clear 4K view as they tear across the snow at 110 miles per hour. They do not dodge the shotguns. They outrun them. They ignore the tracers. There is only one target, the primary hydraulic hinge, the single point where 60 tons of steel meets the T-80 chassis. It is the bridge's Achilles heel. With 95% of the bridge's weight leaning forward, that hinge is under more stress than a Russian bank account. The first fiber-optic Hornet strikes with surgical precision. A violent thermal event erupts at the main joint. The crew has no time to react before the second drone slams into the secondary support cable. The glass thread snaps behind it. Mission accomplished. Now, physics takes over. Without the hydraulic joint to hold it, the bridge's forward weight becomes its own executioner. Steel snaps with a sound like a freight train hitting a mountain. The main hinge shears off, and 60 tons of engineering plunge straight into the freezing river. The T-80 chassis, a $5 million Frankenstein, is dragged down by the collapsing mass. Its nose buries deep into the mud until the vehicle stands nearly vertical. This is a total catastrophic structural decommissioning. In 5 seconds, a Russian breakthrough becomes a 60-ton roadblock. The armored convoy behind it slams on the brakes, trapped in sludge, watching their only path forward sink into the Kazani turrets. The Russian commander is staring at an empty screen frozen by the sheer brutal efficiency of what is essentially a very long extension cord. Ukraine did not just break a bridge, they ended an entire offensive. The aftermath of this 5-second disaster is a total logistical heart attack for the Kremlin. That $5 million T-80 bridge layer is now a permanent mangled underwater monument blocking the only viable crossing for miles. Behind it, the rest of the convoy, 15 MTLBs and recovery vehicles, have officially been downgraded to sitting ducks stuck neck-deep in freezing sludge with nowhere to go. Ukraine did not walk away after the bridge collapsed. They called in the cleanup crew. Within minutes, tube artillery and cluster munitions began raining down on the paralyzed column. By the time the blizzard cleared, roughly 27 pieces of heavy equipment in this sector alone had undergone mass structural decommissioning. This is the kind of systematic dismantlement that turns a tactical crossing into a graveyard of Russian tax rubles. Let's look at the strategic scorecard. Losing this crossing point completely freezes the supply chain for the entire southern PCR's front. Moscow spent all of December trying to build momentum for a New Year's breakthrough. That momentum now looks like a freight train slamming into a wall of wet cement. Every Russian unit stranded across the river is effectively on an island waiting for supplies that are never coming. This creates a brutal strategic dilemma for Moscow. To prevent another disaster, they are forced to pull precious electronic warfare units off active front lines to protect rear area logistics. In other words, they are weakening their own offensive just to stop a drone controlled by a wire. Meanwhile, Footage of this 60-ton Frankenstein snapping like a twig is already going viral, exposing Russian improvisation for what it really is, a desperate, expensive failure. The economics are even more brutal. Ukraine traded roughly $8,000 worth of modified fiber-optic drones for more than $7 million in destroyed armor and weeks of strategic paralysis. Not even the most aggressive hedge fund on Wall Street could dream of a 30,000% return on investment like that. So, what's the lesson today, folks? When you are so desperate that you have to weld scrap metal onto a $5 million tank just to cross a 70-foot ditch, it might be time to reevaluate your life choices. Ukraine just proved that a single well-placed extension cord is enough to bring an entire offensive to a screeching, muddy halt. What do you think? Did you expect that 60-ton beast to nosedive so perfectly? Or did you think Russia's turtle shell actually had a chance? Drop a comment below and let me know. If you enjoyed watching Moscow's biggest tactical gamble of 2026, turn into a permanent riverbed ornament, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Catch you on the next one. Bye for now.